We began this series with the question, what's so hard about translation? Before we could adequately address that question, we needed to make sure that we were on the same page regarding how communication works, and to spend some time exploring the mechanics of language. Having laid that groundwork, we're ready to frame a response. At the beginning of this series, I defined translation as the act of expressing something said, or signed or written in one language as something said, or signed or written in another language. In the course of the intervening videos, we have touched on a bit of what is involved in expressing something in one language, with the hope that doing so would give us some tools to understand why expressing that same thing in another language might not be as straightforward as we might think it should be. From here on out, we'll be taking a closer look at some of the difficulties translators encounter when they try to do just that. In an attempt to reduce the awkwardness of the discussion, we'll begin by defining a few terms. First, we'll use the term source language to refer to the language of the thing that is going to be translated, and target language, or receptor language, to refer to the language that the thing will be translated into. We'll use either source text or original message to refer to the thing that is being translated. This can be anything from a single word to an entire encyclopedia, and can mean something that's either spoken or written. We'll use either translated text or translation to refer to the chunk of spoken or written language that is produced by the translator to convey what is in the original. We'll use the term original audience to designate the person or people for whom a message was originally produced, and the term target or receptor audience to designate the person or people for whom a translation is produced. Finally, the words speaker and author are both used to indicate the originator of the source text, whether written or oral, and translator refers to the person doing the translation. In preceding videos, we considered a number of factors that contribute to the complexity of communication. Each of these factors makes a double contribution to the difficulty of translation, since the complexity that each contributes must be taken into consideration for both the original text in its original setting and the translated text in its target setting. To be successful, the translator must negotiate the difference between the two realities and try to formulate a text that will allow the target audience to infer a set of meanings that are acceptably similar to those inferred by the original audience. Differences in grammar, the meaning of words, culture, and other aspects of context, however, are not the only things that make translation difficult. A second set of challenges arises because the purposes that motivate the translator and the approaches the translator employs may not match the expectations of the people who will eventually interact with the translation that is produced. When this happens, the ensuing disappointment with the translation and the criticism this can engender may result in the rejection of the translated text. Since we've already spent some time considering how languages and contexts can differ, but haven't said much about differing purposes and expectations, we'll briefly mention 4 categories of common expectations before moving on to consider specific examples. First, people usually expect a translation to express the same meaning as the original. Our consideration in video 7 of the different kinds of meaning that texts convey suggests that accomplishing this might be fairly complicated. Secondly, people often feel that some aspect of the structure of the original should be reflected in the structure of the translation. So, for example, people may expect that the elements of a story or an argument in a translated text will appear in the same order as they do in the original text, or that the translation of a poem will sound like a poem. Third, people may want the translated text to function in the target context the way that the original text functioned in the original context. So, for example, the translation of an official pronouncement should sound like an official pronouncement in the target language. Finally, people often expect a translated text to have the same impact as the original. For example, if a text made the original audience laugh, its translation shouldn't make the receptor audience cry. And the translation of an original text that shocked its original readers should be equally scandalous to those who read it in translation. As we'll see, satisfying any one of these expectations can be difficult enough. Achieving all 4 with a single translation is often impossible. Okay, ready to dive in? Let's start with one of the most obvious problems that translators face: Categories in one language don't match categories in another. We've seen several examples of this phenomenon in past videos, but to explore it a bit more in depth, let's think about how we would translate the first sentence we considered in this series. The key is in the trunk. If the things included in the categories that English labels key and trunk were close enough to being the same things included in categories in another language, the challenge involved in translating these words into that language would be considerably reduced. Because every time that source language word was used, you could translate it using the same target language word. However, it's a pretty good bet that there are no languages for which this is the case. In German, for example, there is no single word that can be used to denote all of the things included in the categories for which English uses the term trunk. In German, the trunk in your closet is a Truhe, but you can't use the word Truhe to refer to an elephant's nose or to the trunk of a tree. In German, an elephant's trunk is a Rüssel. The trunk of a car is a Kofferraum, and the trunk of a tree is a Stamm. These words in turn serve as labels for collections that include things that English does not label with trunk, and which probably don't exactly overlap with categories in any other language either. The things we can call keys in English also belong to categories that have different labels in German, and the categories that those labels point to also include things that are not included in the key category in English. This means that to avoid picking German words to translate key and trunk that will lead recipients of the translation to infer the wrong thing, the translator must understand the situational aspect of the original context. In other words, the translator must understand what the words key and trunk are referring to in the original text. If the translator does not understand the original context, there's a good chance that he will pick words that will convey misinformation to the recipients of the translation. But will picking words that can denote the right object guarantee that the target audience will infer the right meaning? Not necessarily. While German words aren't ambiguous in the same way that English words are, they are still ambiguous. For example, Rüssel can mean either an elephant's trunk or a mosquito's proboscis, and a Taste can be a panic button or a piano key. This means that to be sure of attributing the correct meaning to the translation, the readers or hearers of the translation must also have at least some understanding of the original context as well. So far, we have only considered the challenges of finding category labels in the target language that will allow recipients of translations to correctly infer what is being pointed to in the text. In video 7, we called this kind of information the denotative meaning of words, and we distinguished the denotative meaning from the connotative meaning, by which we mean, more or less, information that words convey about the speaker's attitude towards or opinion about the things being discussed. Sometimes connotative meaning is conveyed by using words that normally denote a subcategory of the person or thing being denoted. For example, the word brat usually denotes a child with a disagreeable disposition, and jalopy usually denotes a car in poor condition. However, a lot of connotative meaning in any language is conveyed by using category labels to denote things and people that are not normally considered part of that category. For example, the words angel and peach and chicken do not typically evoke people. They are, however, often used to denote people. And when they are, they also convey the speaker's opinion of some aspect of that person's character. Using category labels in this way creates problems for translation, because it may be impossible to find a word in the target language that can both denote the thing that the original label typically denotes, and that also conveys the same connotative meaning as the source language word. When this is the case, what should the translator do? There are often several options. It might be possible to find a label in the target language that has the same connotative meaning as the original, even though it may typically denote something else. It might be best to try using a category label in the target language whose typical denotations overlap with those of the original, and then try to convey the connotative meaning another way. It might be necessary to just drop the metaphor completely and express the connotative meaning directly. If the translation is in written form, footnotes might be included to tell the reader how the translation decision was handled. The choice of which approach to use will depend as much on the purpose of the translation and the expectations of the target audience as on the meanings of the words. Is the translator more concerned with preserving the structure of the original or with replicating its impact? Does the target audience agree with these priorities, or are they hoping for something different?